Hazel Wodehouse. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Back to the Bays, which is part of Cornell Cooperative Extension Marine Program. And our entire mission of this program and Back to the Bays is to restore our local environments, help raise awareness, raise funds, and educate the youth and really everybody. So part of what we do involves getting the public involved. The more you guys know about the world around us, the more you can help, make choices at home and participate in all the work that we're doing. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, I also wanted to tell you that as the volunteer coordinator, if any of you are interested in participating in any of our work, we have lots of different jobs that suit everybody's needs. We've been doing things over the summer from horseshoe crab tagging to looking for seahorses and measuring them. And we have actually found some this summer, which is great. We have another event coming up in August. So if you are interested, talk to me after. I'll get you the right website and paperwork so that you can find our volunteer activities. And then coming up in the fall is really our habitat program. Runs year round, but in the fall we start working on eelgrass restoration, and we really depend on citizen scientists to come get involved with us and help us restore eelgrass. Today you guys are going to hear all about aquaculture, specifically our lovely oyster, which we all hold near and dear, I hope. If you don't eat them, they are really helping our water stay clean. And you're going to hear from Gregg Rivara. So without further ado, here's Gregg.
Thanks, Hazel. Well, thanks for being here. And I wanted to put a few slides up about Cornell Extension. Those of you who don't know, can you see? Am I blocking? I'll let you read through these slides yourselves, but we basically have a bunch of programs. We've been around for over 100 years. And a marine program specifically started in 1985. And those are our programs within the marine program with about 70 plus full-time staff. Thank you. And that's our mission. Can you guys read that in the back? Kate, can you read that? So I'm not going to go through these. I'm going to let you read it, and I'll expand upon some of them. The 1884 year is important because that's when the state gave the county the right to basically grant in perpetuity on the waterlands in the Peconic estuary system. It goes back that far. You know about the leasing program now. Well, it goes back to 1884. So some of the first hatchery work in the United States was done here on Long Island, specifically in Bayville and West Sayville, Oyster Bay, and Brookhaven Towns. And then in 1969, the state said to the county, no more grants. You can only lease underwater land, because there were issues with how some of that was done. And nothing happened for decades. And then in '86, the first municipal hatchery in Islip was started. And one of the reasons they did that is a lot of the towns felt they couldn't get the size seed they wanted from the commercial hatcheries at that time. And this is pretty important, the 2009 and then 2010, when the first leases were granted by Suffolk County for shellfish cultivation. So from 1884 to 2010, a lot had changed. And then Islip Town started a leasing program, and 2015, a few years later, Brookhaven did as well. And then 10 years after the Suffolk County aquaculture leasing program was started, they underwent a 10-year review, and that was by law. They had to do that. And so going back a ways, these are little oysters that are growing on shells, And when we talk about seed today, we talk about individual oysters, but back then there were no hatcheries. This is probably in the 1920s or 30s. And they would move the oysters around from the setting beds to a grow-out area, and then harvest them a year or so later. Some of you might recognize the smokestack in that building. That's the old oyster factory in East Marion, Shipyard Lane. That's under a lot of scrutiny right now with condos maybe. So that was a pretty important working waterfront. You can see the shell pile in the right rear there. And those are all wooden boats that will go out and harvest oysters. This is in Oyster Bay, and this is the Flowers Oyster Company in Oyster Bay. So a little more modern, but still, they still use wooden boats. Shucking House on Sterling Avenue in Greenport Village. Same place. This is the Shelter Island Oyster Company, who never really had a presence on Shelter Island, but they had an office in Manhattan and Broadway, and this is the Shucking House in Greenport. And besides cans, back then they used to put oysters, now these are live oysters, not shucked, in barrels, in wooden barrels, and put burlap tops on them. And that hoop you see, they would hammer that hoop down. And the burlap was a wax paper backing, and that allowed the oysters to breathe. And they would put these barrels on train cars, and they go, especially for the holiday, unrefrigerated largely, all the way across the country for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And those barrel covers are kind of hard to find. Here's another one from Washington White. And this is something that I bought on eBay decades ago probably. And the cool thing about it is the Oyster Institute of North America, that little trident thing, it's long gone. But the cool thing about it is the Good Housekeeping magazine approved basically raw oysters for consumption. And there's a little number there, it says 4920 to the right of that star. And I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago, I actually emailed Good Housekeeping and asked them, is any record of that in your records, you know, the archives? They had no idea what I was talking about. It was kind of funny. So I don't think you'd see that again. This is outside of that Shelter Island Oyster Company shucking house in Greenport, where the condos are now, the new Sterling 123 condos, for those of you that know Greenport. And that's like basically a 2-story high shell pile. And those shells would go back into the leases, to the grounds, to catch more baby oysters. Again, this is all predating oyster hatcheries or shellfish hatcheries. This is really, to me, this is really funny. This is 1932, and guys from the Bureau of Fisheries and the Oyster Growers and Dealers Association of North America are presenting President Herbert Hoover the first oysters of the season, September 1st, right, once with ours. So we don't really go to the White House anymore and bring, you know, Biden or anybody oysters anymore, but that's how important, that's how big the industry was back then. It was a much bigger deal than it is today. And this is Oscar the Oyster was the Shelter Island Oyster Company's kind of Mr. Peanut, if you will. And you can still find stuff on eBay with Oscar on it. Neckties, there's playing cards. These little hooks, there'd be a calendar that you would tear off, and when it got to September, there would not be a September, I should say. That's when you would see that oysters are here. So the calendar ended in August. So this is 1903, a penny for a clam or oyster in Manhattan, like a hot dog stand. I'll let you read this for yourselves. Blue Point oyster is like Scotch tape, or Kleenex. It's not a trademark, but it's sort of like one. So that's over 100 years old, that law, and I believe it's still on the books. The problem is people in other areas can put on their package Blue Point oyster, one word. There's no space, because Blue Point is a town, right, on the South Shore of Long Island. So you can sell Blue Point oysters, one word, and get around it, and by the way, there's really no enforcement anyway. This is a 1930s era map of the oyster grounds in the Peconic and Gardiner's Bays, sort of the precursor to our leasing program today, going back to 1884. And All those little trapezoids have people's names associated with them, either people or companies. This is one of my favorite cartoons. It's an oyster running out of Jamaica Bay because of sewage. It was closed in 1921, so basically over 101 years ago. And me and my colleagues still do work in Oyster Bay in Jamaica Bay. And we actually planted oysters by JFK Airport. So the DEC lets us put certain kinds of oysters in there, and by the airport there's a lot of scrutiny. There's cameras, there's patrols, so they're not as worried about poaching by the airport. And oysters grow really well there. So what about today? Again, I'm going to let you read these for yourselves so we get some audience participation. And that's important. About 90% of New York State production of oysters is farmed. About 10% is wild caught, and that changes a little bit every year. And most is sold direct. So this is, you saw those big boats, some of them were steam powered back in the day. So this is more like it today, small cages. This guy is a bayman who also got into oyster farming. This is in Great South Bay by Sexton Island. Very shallow water there. You can walk on your farm at low tide especially. Might recognize these guys. I didn't know you were going to be here. Ben and Dave from South Old Bay Oysters. So again, this is the scale of it. Some folks have a little bit of a bigger boat. It's an old lobster boat. This is on Fisher's Island, so there's suspended nets are used. That's a map of the leasing program. All that black stuff are potential leases, but I should say before you say, well, they're going to lease out the whole bay, that they're only allowed to lease 60 acres per year, and they're leasing out 10 acres at a time, so that's 6 leases a year. It's really a small amount, and that's what had to be done to get the program through, with opposition from other user groups. So this is about the SCALP, the Suffolk County Aquaculture Leasing Program. And these numbers may have changed a little bit this year. I'm going to go into the hatchery now. This is a lot of these photographs are from our hatchery. One I started in 1991 for the town of Southold at the Marine Center down at Cedar Beach County Park. So we start with this single cell plants, phytoplankton, microalgae. Different species here, that's the different colors. And we scale it up to something like this. So now we're growing, hundreds of gallons of phytoplankton. This is what we feed our broodstock shellfish, and we're growing clams, oysters, and bay scallops at the Marine Center. This talk is really mostly about oysters, but we grow those other 2 species with the same kinds of food. And this is a spawning tray. We'll put the adult oysters in these Pyrex baking dishes and raise the temperature up and basically cause them to spawn. And that's after about 8 weeks of conditioning. We can do this in February rather than wait till July. These are 100-gallon conical tanks that were donated to us literally from the 1970s. And they were based on wine fermenters. If you look at the bottom of them, they have a cone. It's like a big ice cream cone. And that 60-degree cone is very important for collecting any dead food and also dead larvae, unfertilized eggs. And it's aerated from the bottom, so it's round, there's no dead spots. This is our new hatchery with some much higher tech stuff. Some of the same species, but these are photobioreactors. We have 4 of them, and they grow a lot of algae in a small space. And this is another system in that new hatchery, similar to what I showed you earlier, but more bags. These are their conicals. I say their conicals. There's 2 hatcheries on the site that produce for the state and the towns. These are eyed oyster larvae. So within 24 hours, the baby oysters that we put in those conicals get a shell. It's a transparent shell. And that little black dot in the middle of that one is called an eye spot. It's not really an eye, but it kind of tells us that they're ready to set. They're going to glue themselves on something for the rest of their lives. And this is what they look like in a pail, you know, tens of millions. It looks like pepper flakes when they're that size. There's probably about 10 to 15 million oyster larvae in that little bit of screening. And what we do with that is we can take it, we can send it across the country, we can set it in our backyard, but we need something to set it on, and we use recycled oyster shell. And this is my pickup truck a few years ago, full of oyster shells, probably from Little Creek Oyster in Greenport, one of the restaurants I get shell from every Monday. We also got shell from a place in Bayshore that shucks surf clams for bait. So the surf clams are the ocean skimmer clams that you would see on the ocean beaches. They're not as good as oysters, but we can get a lot of them fairly quickly and fairly cheaply. But the issue with all the shells is they got to sit out for about a year in the sun and the air. So a year later, we put them at the town dump. A year later, the dump is nice enough to pick our shells up, put them back in that dump trailer, and then we put them through a shell washer. It looks like this with that conveyor and that hopper to clean all the stuff off. They go in these trays. This is one of the set tanks we have at the Marine Center. The PVC pipe in the bottom is an aeration system to keep the water moving, because the larvae are still swimming, but we want to keep them gently, and we also want to aerate them as well. There's also a heater in there and a source of salt water from the bay. And this is what it looks like before we put the water in, with the baskets full of the clean shell. That's a bag that we filter the water with. That's number 5 is a 5 micron, so it doesn't let anything bigger than good algae in, good phytoplankton from the bay, because we might as well use a natural production. And we're doing this in May, June, and July largely. Here what the tanks look like when they're aerating and full of water. We usually cover them with tarps to keep the heat in, because we're heating them up into the 80s, and also to keep the light out, because we don't want the larvae to go to the bottom. They don't like the light. They want to go to the bottom. You know, think about in nature. They go from a planktonic swimming form to a benthic form. They go right to the bottom. So this gives us a better distribution, the air and the covering. So this is about probably 5 million oyster larvae with a quarter there. It's about an inch. After a week or so, this is what you want to see, a bunch of oysters set on the shell. And then a month later, they're a lot bigger. We take them in a boat, and we'll plant them in a site. This happens to be in Brookhaven Town, off of Shirley, Bellport Bay. And after a year or so, this is what you get. These nice clusters of oysters that you wouldn't really put in a restaurant, but they create a lot of habitat. And that caliper, that yellow thing, is set at 1 inch or 25 millimeters, same size as that quarter. So you can see the growth on them. Again, you could read this for yourselves. And the LISERP is the Long Island Shellfish Restoration Program. That's kind of on its way out now. This is a reef that we developed at the Shinnecock Nation, the reservation in Southampton. It's hard to see it, but it basically creates a wave break parallel to the shore. And if you looked to your left, you'd see the Ponquag Bridge, to give you an idea where this is. It's on the western shore of the reservation. So that's what we do with those spat-on shell, create these living shorelines. So that $14 billion number is, you can see it's dated by a few years. It's probably worse now. And even though we're growing stuff, we're nothing compared to other countries. This is about the world now. So about half of our seafood is farmed. It's messing up. So it is the fastest growing form of agriculture is aquaculture, almost 9% since 1970. So it went from 1 million metric ton to 80 in those years, worth about $232 billion in 2016. And mollusks are clams, oysters, and scallops. So there's a lot of fish farms, but a lot of them are just mom and pops in China, quite frankly. So we're pretty far down on the list. 16th in worldwide production. I mean, Iran is right behind us. And it's worth about $1.5 billion in the United States, aquaculture now. And that's everything, not just oysters. That includes trout, salmon, that kind of thing. This is kind of a little busy slide that NOAA put out, Department of Commerce. The interesting thing is the upper right-hand corner. Oysters, and you probably can't read it in the back, but oysters account for the most, $192 million in revenue. So more than the other species you see there, because shrimp's a really small industry in the United States. So what are the benefits of growing shellfish? I skipped ahead there. That pelagic benthic coupling, what does that mean? The phytoplankton are producing, like cows eat grass, the phytoplankton are the primary producers. If you're a worm in the bottom of the bay or a crab foraging, you really can't get to that phytoplankton. It's above you, floating around. What shellfish do, what filter feeders do, is take that cestin, that algae, and through feces and pseudofeces and biodeposits, they make that available to worms and crabs and what we call deposit feeders, things that crawl through the sand and eat things. That's what pelagic benthic coupling means. And habitat's a big deal, whether it's the oyster reefs we create or the commercial farmers. And that's important, that we're not really putting pressure on wild stocks. But we're going to balance it with some risks. And these are risks. They're not really something that happens very often, but they can happen. And this came up with the aesthetic issues came up with the aquaculture leasing program with floating gear. Some people objected to seeing these buoys and oyster cages on the surface, even though the nearest oyster farm by law has got to be 1,000 feet from the high tide mark. But it can be an issue. And that exceed carrying capacity, if you have like 1 billion oysters in a little pond, there's not enough phytoplankton to feed them. This has never happened on Long Island or probably anywhere in the world to my knowledge, but it is a potential. So what about the future? And by the non-commercial sector, I'm talking about what my colleague does, Kim Tetro, at the SPAT program, the Suffolk Project in Aquaculture Training, by having non-commercial people garden oysters, and also what we do and other nonprofits do. So everyone's concerned about climate change. Oysters and clams will probably be fine. The bay scallop, not so much, because they're at the southern end of their range here. So as you know, we had die-offs the last 3 years now of the adults. They just can't deal with the warming waters once they spawn. So there's always going to be, not always, but now there are these bugs, the baby scallops, but the parents die and there's no harvest. And ocean acidification is something to think about. It's not as bad as it is on the West Coast because we have a continental shelf here and we have much bigger buffering capacity to keep the water from getting too acidic. Working waterfront's a big issue. I just talked about condos. We just talked about the old oyster factory. It's definitely an issue on Long Island and New England, the Northeast. Permitting can be difficult. You can ask some of the farmers in the room, and you can ask me because I get permits to do reefs. And between the Army Corps is a big one generally. Our DEC is actually pretty helpful to us at Region 1 here. That's what we do, education and outreach. So we saw this earlier, the 1 cent. So this is, you know, basically like pretzels on Manhattan Street. And then the next slide is more like what's happening today. This is Charles Massoud, the owner of Peconic Vineyards in Aquabog, and Rachel Ray having a, you know, an oyster for a lot more than a penny back a number of years ago. So that's all I got. Thanks for your attention.